What is up, crime scene crew? Today's story actually runs alongside this set of nails pretty well. The story has to do with eyeballs or a lack thereof. So, just as our usual disclaimer, this story contains graphic acts of violence, so viewer discretion is advised. Please be careful if you come across any parts of this story that you feel may affect your mental health. Do not proceed, turn away. There are other videos on this channel that contain, just tutorials, or just go to another channel. I fully believe in watching out for your mental health, so just viewer discretion is advised. August 10th, 1933, Charles Albright was born in Amarillo, Texas, but from causes unknown, he was put up for adoption. Now, Charles ended up getting adopted from an orphanage from a man and woman named Dell and Fred Albright. Dell was a school teacher while Fred was working at the grocery store. Dell seemed to be a pretty smart woman. She actually helped Charles skip a couple grades in school, and she helped further him along in all of his classes. But people say she seemed to be strict over education, but she was really protective over Charles. She actually ended up getting him a gun in his early teens, and Charles ended up liking shooting small animals and stuffing them with it. He wanted, he was trying to do taxidermy, and so Dell bought him a mail order taxidermy kit. And this woman actually helped him to stuff these animals. And since they were a poor lower class family, they couldn't seem to afford the glass eyeballs that you would stuff real animals with. So, after doing all of the work for this stuffed creature, he ended up having to sew up the eye sockets with black buttons, and that did not make him very happy. At 13, he was already getting in trouble for things like petty theft and aggravated assault, but it seemed to get overlooked when at 15 he actually graduated from high school and enrolled in North Texas University. Now, during college, he let everybody know that, he was interested in becoming a doctor or a surgeon, and he actually got the chance at 15 to start taking pre-med training, but he never ended up finishing it. And at the age of 16, he ended up getting caught with some petty cash and two handguns and a rifle. So he ended up having to go to jail for a year. So after he was released from jail a year later, he attended Arkansas State Teachers College, and he ended up majoring in pre-med studies, but he ended up getting found with stolen items and got expelled from college. He was never prosecuted, but he couldn't go back. He really didn't care though, actually. He ended up just falsifying a degree and stole documents, forging the signatures, and giving himself a bachelor's and master's degree. He ended up marrying one of his college girlfriends, and they had a daughter, but he ended up doing stupid things like forging checks, and he ended up getting caught while he was teaching at a high school. So he was just placed on probation, But in 1965, he and his wife ended up getting a divorce. Right after the divorce, he ended up getting caught stealing hundreds of dollars worth of stuff from a hardware store, and he received a 2-year prison sentence. But you guys know how it goes. He served less than 6 months before he was released. But during this time, he ended up befriending and gaining the trust of his neighbors, and he was even asked by local residents to babysit their children. In 1981, visiting some friends, he sexually molested their 14-year-old daughter. He was prosecuted, pled guilty, and received probation. He later claimed he was innocent, but he pled guilty to avoid the hassle. Yeah. And then the dum dum in 1984 applied to be the leader in the Boy Scouts of America, but was rejected. Now, I honestly can't say the Boy Scouts dodged a bullet there because we all know that history. Now, I'm not sure if it was after his parents' death or just that his parents had properties that he stayed at. But Charles did have a couple properties that he would stay at. He got them from his parents. And in 1985, he ended up meeting a woman named Dixie. And Dixie worked. So she ended up supporting Charles and paying his bills. And Charles ended up living off of her, but he got a newspaper route so that he could leave the house with an excuse, and he would use this to go into town and hang out with prostitutes. This is the point where I'm going to remind you that if you think you get squeamish or that graphic, violent stories disturb you, this is where the story kind of takes a hard left. So, just as a warning, this is the point you might want to turn back. December 10th, 1990, in a lower class area off far south Dallas, a man walks outside and sees a large woman, about 156 pounds, completely naked. She has a t-shirt and bra on, but they're pushed up, exposing her breasts. Her eyes were shut and her face and chest were badly bruised and beaten. Apparently, the killer thought it was best to beat her before firing a 44 caliber bullet into her brain. The woman this man seen was dead. This man, so horrified by what he's seen, ran back into his home, grabbing a flower bed blanket, running back outside, and tossing it over the body. The body ended up being the body of Mary Pratt. She was 33 years old at the time, and she was a local prostitute, although her parents never knew this about her. She ended up working down at the Star Motel, and the police at the time, when they were talking about the events, they would speak about women like Mary as the Oak Cliff whores. Now, Mary was known to be very docile, very quiet. She would wear jeans, tennis shoes, just a t-shirt. She wouldn't stand out on the corners calling to her tricks. She would just stand over by buildings, waiting for the perfect opportunity. She never had a lot of money, and the little bit of money that she would make, she would just spend on drugs, but she always kept to herself and never caused problems. Mary ended up living with her parents, so sometimes at the end of the night, she would end up asking, one of her tricks or John's if they could please just take her home to her parents' house. And her parents, not knowing what it was their 33-year-old daughter was doing, would just remember or look back on the times where she would come in and they would just yell out, "We love you, good night." A man by the name of Westphalen was one of Dallas's investigators, and he was known to say that this case that he got of Mary Pratt's dumped body would end up relying more on good luck than good investigation, due to the fact that dumped bodies are one of the hardest cases to figure out. This victim being killed in one place and then dumped in another with no witnesses to the murder or the dumping of the body, no forensic evidence, and no fingerprints. There was no apparent motive. And with all the people that come and go from the Star Motel where Mary was last seen, that leaves a long list of possibilities. Now, after Westphalen, detectives, police officers, after everyone combs the crime scene, Mary Pratt's body ends up being released to the medical examiner or coroner. And when the body arrived and the coroner started her examination, everything seemed intact, including the Playboy bunny tattoo that Mary had. But once getting further into the exam, the coroner lifted up one of Mary's eyelids and realized there was no eyeball. Lifting up the second eyelid, again, no eyeball. But this wasn't visible. With the eyelids shut, you couldn't even tell that her eyes were missing. And this is a big thing. It's not easy to take out eyeballs from a human body without leaving some type of struggle. There was no cuts. And the human eye not only has nerves attached, it has muscles, tough ropes. It's very hard to slip a knife around the back of an eyeball and cut away everything that is attached to the body and then pull the eyeball out without leaving some type of trace or just an idea of what had happened. You should have been able to see that somebody had taken the eyeballs out. But there was no evidence of this. And that told the coroner one big detail. This criminal knew how to remove eyeballs the correct way professionally. This person knew what they were doing when it came to this task. Now, because of these facts, Westphalen, the investigator, ended up calling the FBI and doing a search for morbid crimes, anything that matched up to this crime scene. And the FBI told Westphalen there is nothing on record. And Westphalen ended up saying, "What kind of person would want a girl's eyeballs?" It made no sense. The investigators and detective asked the public for tips, but they didn't do it in the most common way you would think. They wanted to keep most of the evidence to themselves, so when tips would come in, they could tell whether they were genuine or not. If someone possibly ended up telling them details that was not released, then the police would know that this person was telling the truth. So Mary Pratt's death and murder ended up only becoming a two-page backstory at the very last pages of the local newspaper. So, not only did the public not know the details of this murder, or a lot of people just didn't hear about it at all, Remember, Mary Pratt wasn't really a known person in society. She really did live, in the slums and she had no friends. So nobody really knew about this murder, including two officers. On December 13th, two officers ended up going on their beat, which included that Star Motel, the one the police called the Oak Cliff Whore's place to stay. At this motel, they end up seeing a girl by the name of Veronica Rodriguez. She was only 26 years old, but Veronica is one of those people, if you ever had that family member that says a whole lot of words, but it means a whole lot of nothing, they just ramble and talk a lot, and sometimes it adds up to something and you realize it later on, but then a lot of times it adds up to nothing. That's kind of how Veronica is. It's really sad, that this girl was just ate up from drugs and she ended up getting arrested several times for prostitution. One time she was actually arrested for prostitution when she was 9 months pregnant. The baby ended up being stillborn and she ended up going on to have at least one other child, but her main recreation was just drugs. And Veronica had kind of lost her mind in the eyes of everyone that knew her. Nobody really listened to what she had to say. So when the officers seen Veronica and they seen a gash above her eye and a slit across her throat, obviously not fatal, but the officers rolled down the window and asked her, "Hey girl, what happened to you?" That's when Veronica immediately responded and said, "Don't arrest me, don't arrest me. I was almost killed." Now, as it happens with most criminals, when they get caught in the act, they tend to have a pity story or some type of story to try to get them off the hook. So when the officers heard Rodriguez say, that she had almost been killed, they kind of figured this was just another pity story. She had probably been into a fight with another prostitute or, with a John, but the fact that she was almost killed kind of seemed a little bit outlandish. It wasn't until the very next day they drive back down their beat near the Star Motel, and there they see Veronica, but she's in a pickup with a white man, middle-aged, salt and pepper hair. The officers walk up on each side of the car, one officer pulling out Veronica and the other officer speaking to the male. That's when Veronica yells out real loud, "Don't arrest him! Don't arrest him! That's the man that saved me." Now, Veronica ends up going on to tell them a story about how she had been picked up by a man and driven out to the country, but it was there when the man actually raped her and tried to kill her. But she was able to get away and run to a nearby house, and it was the house of the same man she was with now, and that this man actually ended up saving her life. She ran right in and she told him about what happened, and he protected her and he drove her home. Now, when the police asked the man was very nervous. He was talking really fast, but he denied all of it. He said he knew Veronica, but that this never happened. He didn't know what she was talking about the other night, and that she had never run into his house, and that she had never said that she was almost killed. He said that he just knew her from being around. He was a nice person and a long distance truck driver. So when he would see her, he would just give her rides. February 1991. A second victim was found. Like deja vu. It was very similar to the way Mary Pratt had been dumped. And literally, it was on the same street. It was just at the other end of the street outside city limits. The woman was named Susan Peterson. She was only 27 years old. Now, Susan was not like our meek Mary. She was not quiet. She was known to stand her ground. Yes, she was a prostitute, but she was very good at what she did. She was known just a couple years earlier for being one of the most beautiful whores of Oak Cliff, and she was a great pickpocket. As she was sleeping with her tricks, she was great at getting into their wallet and robbing them of all of their money. She would not take no for an answer. She was great at getting 10 to 12 tricks a day. And when other girls would come near her area, she would threaten them and tell them she was ready to fight. She wasn't letting anybody take what was hers. So the fact that somebody had gotten her tells a whole story in itself, because it wasn't easy to get over on Susan. It had to be someone that she knew. Now, because this happened outside city limits, even though it was on the same street, Dallas is a pretty big city. Literally, it was on the other side, the whole other end of town, on the other end of the road, all the way out in the country. So, this ended up falling into the hands of a different investigator in a different district or precinct. I'm not sure what you would call it, but it fell into a different jurisdiction. So, the new officers, investigators, they end up coming in to investigate the crime scene, and nobody really knew about what happened to Mary Pratt. So, this wasn't looked at as a serial killer, or nobody knew yet. So the investigators comb over the crime scene and send the body to the morgue. But it was there at the morgue when the coroner was looking at the body and found that the two eyes were missing. The coroner told the investigator about how a body had just been found a couple months earlier with this same mutilations. Now, this investigator drove down into Dallas and spoke with Westphalen. They went over the details of the crime, and investigators and detectives decided that they was gonna still yet again keep details of the crime a secret, so that if people wanted to give tips, they could tell again, whether the person is being truthful or not, knowing what they know, pretty much. So they wasn't that good at it this time, though. Detectives ended up leaking information to the newspapers. They didn't tell the newspapers that the eyeballs were taken out, but the newspapers ended up finding out about the mutilations of the face and how it was almost surgical precision. So this leaks, and the community finds out. Now, if you remember the officers that I was just speaking with you about and them talking to Veronica Rodriguez, when the story hits the papers and these officers are driving around reading their paper, they're talking about it and they realize they had a tip. But since the time that they had gotten this tip from Veronica, her story had changed several times. It went from the fact that she was only attacked and raped to the fact that she had seen Mary Pratt get murdered. And then her story had changed several times, and people just kind of, put it off on the fact that she was fried from drugs. Oh, yeah. And these officers, they didn't want to get in the way of the homicide detectives. They didn't want to try to do homicide's job for them. They didn't want to get in the way, basically. But they had to do something, right? So they called in their tip. They called in the fact that they had ran into Veronica Rodriguez earlier, a couple months earlier, when the Mary Pratt killing happened, and what Veronica had said, and the white man that she was in the truck with. They gave up all the information that they had. But later on, West Phelan, the investigator, claimed that he never got the tip, with all the reports flooding in from the newspaper leaking the information. Everything ended up getting lost in the commotion pretty much, and that lead that should have been there was slipping away because yet another attack was about to happen. March 19th, 1991. Westphalen is doing the best that he can with what he has. He has no forensic evidence. He has no eyewitness reports because, again, Veronica Rodriguez's testimony or just her conversation with the police officers has not surfaced yet for Westphalen. That got lost. So, he's going back and forth to the crime scenes. He's going over the reports. He's talking to officers. He's doing everything that he can. And he has three questions that he asks over and over at every meeting that they come to. He says, we've got to answer three questions. Number one, why is he after prostitutes? Number two, why were the bodies dumped on the same street? And number three, why were those eyes cut out? And also, up until this point, in the meetings with West Phelan and other investigators, they refuse to call this a serial killer. They just keep calling the murderer, a repeater. Now, it's on this day in the early morning, March 19th, where everything kind of goes sideways. Everything changes. A prostitute by the name of Shirley Williams was seen leaving the Avalon Motel, where she worked as a maid during the day and turned tricks at night. According to people who've seen her, she was wearing jeans and a yellow raincoat, but that she was kind of staggering around really high. It was the very next day at 6:20 in the morning, police found her body. She was dumped one block from an elementary school. And being found at 6:20 in the morning, children were on their way to school, seeing this woman's naked body with an open condom laying next to it. Her body was badly beaten and crumpled against the curb. Westphalen appears and tells the examiners, go look, tell me if they're missing. The coroner goes over to the body, opens the eyeballs, and sure enough, he yells out, yup, they're gone. Now, everything has changed. There's an open condom, and when they end up sending Shirley's body to the examiner, during the examination, the broken tip of an X-Acto blade was found embedded in the skin near her right eye. There was no witnesses, no murder weapon, no fingerprints, and worse, the killer now murdered a black woman, and he had moved locations. But just as detectives had feared, the publicity on the case just skyrocketed. And this being in South Dallas this time, there was no telling where the murderer was going to strike again. Now, you remember the two officers I spoke about that spoke to Veronica Rodriguez. After publicity came out about this crime, the third crime, these officers really felt it that they needed to protect the whores that were on their beat. So they did their due diligence and made sure that they They stayed very close to that star motel. And it's here where a prostitute tells them, that she's getting ready to get out of town. Before this, it was only white women killed. But the third woman being a black woman, this prostitute being black, she said she was done. She's leaving. She wants to go. And that the other night, a white man with salt and pepper hair had attacked her. She never wanted to go anywhere beside a whore's hotel so that she could make sure that she was safe. She was never going to go to a trick's house, to the side of a road. She would only go to a motel. So when this trick with the salt and pepper hair, the white man, when he told her that he had a better place to go to, she told him, "Pull over, I'm getting out." And the man, he got so mad, his face changed, and he told her, "I'm gonna kill all you mother effing whores." These officers, remembering back to Veronica's story, and when they picked her up in the truck with the man, the white man with salt and pepper hair, they remembered back to that man's name. The man gave the name Axton Schindler. Address was 1035 El Dorado Road. The officers decided they wanted to look into this man, but they knew that their city police computers wouldn't put out a wide enough search. So they decided to end up going out to the Dallas County Constable's office, and it was there they found a deputy on duty that was willing to help them. So they searched for Axton Schindler and the address 1035 El Dorado Road. But the only name that came up was Fred Albright. That didn't really make sense. So they ended up punching in another code, and it stated that Fred Albright also owned property on a street called Cotton Valley. And Cotton Valley was near the neighborhood in South Dallas where the two prostitutes in the beginning were found. Now, the two officers looking at the screen are wondering, what does Fred Albright, Axton Schindler, and Charles Albright have in common? Now, I don't want to confuse you. I'm adding Charles Albright to the list because it's at this moment the officer remembers back to a prostitute telling him about how Mary Pratt had dated a man named Charles Albright. And the screen that's sitting in front of the officer right now is showing that 1035 El Dorado Road address as being owned by a Fred Albright. But Fred Albright is showing up as dead in their system. So Charles Albright has to be included here somewhere. And if Fred Albright is dead, how is Charles Albright connected to this Axton Schindler? So the officers not Google, search. The officers searched the name Charles Albright, and what do they find? They find the address 1035 El Dorado Road. They have to be connected. So now doing the background check on Charles Albright, a whole string of charges end up popping up, of course, of which belong, the string of thefts, the string of burglaries, forgeries, the charge of sexual intercourse with a child. The officer that's helping these cops end up pulling out mugshots, and he pulls out the mugshot of Charles Albright, and one of the officers just get a huge grin right in front of them. is the picture of
So
Axon
now we're
Schindler.
running into another problem. These officers have no concrete evidence on this Axon Schindler or Charles Albright, whatever you want to call him. The officers don't have any evidence. They only have their suspicions, so they decide to go talk to this infamous investigator, Westphalen. And Westphalen ends up agreeing to see the officers. And the officers proceed to tell the investigator everything that they had found out. And Westphalen decides these officers have to be on to something. So they decide to round up some mugshots, including Charles Albright's mugshot, and round up Veronica Rodriguez and a couple other prostitutes who had tips for the officers. And getting all these prostitutes together, one prostitute points out Charles Albright. And then when it comes to Veronica, she's looking at the photos and everything's fine until she gets to Charles Albright's photo. This is when she begins to shake and cry. She says she doesn't want to do it anymore. But without her testimony as knowing and stating that she saw him kill Mary Pratt and that he had tried to kill her too, everything was gonna fall flat. They really needed Veronica's testimony. So the officers call Westphalen and tell him what's going on. And the investigator says, "Bring her into me." So, sitting in an interrogation room with Westphalen, he decides that he's gonna go easy on this girl. Watching her shake and cry, he sees that she's about to lock up. So he sets out the mugshots and he describes in detail to this 26-year-old girl everything that happened to all three victims and how it was up to this girl. It was on her shoulders because the cops, they just couldn't catch him. It was on this girl's shoulders, and it should be on her conscience that if she doesn't pick out the picture, this is going down the drain. So, after the spiel, Veronica, looking at the pictures, turns to Charles Albright's picture, flips it over, and signs her name. On March 23rd, 1991, Albright was arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder. His trial began on December 13th, 1991. Now, during the arrest, the officers searched his land and property. They found X-Acto knives and they found guns and rifles, but none of them was the murder weapon, and none of them had any evidence linking Charles to the murders. And during the trial, the defense for Charles ended up using Veronica Rodriguez's testimony. You know, Veronica stated during the trial that Westphalen had coerced her into pointing out the picture of Charles and that she had been intimidated. In the end, it ended up being squirrel hairs that got Charles convicted of murder. Now, there ended up being squirrel hairs found on Albright's vacuum cleaner, and squirrel hairs were found at the Williams murder site. So, on December 18th, 1991, the jury deliberated and found Charles Albright guilty only on one of the murder charges, and it was for the murder of Shirley Williams. All right, guys, I'm going to end this story here. What do you guys think about this story? From the beginning, when Charles ended up killing small animals, how his mother protected him, how he ended up getting child molestation charges and only serving 6 months in jail. I mean,
This is all telltale signs, and I really feel like yet again the justice system drops the ball. But I want to hear what you have to say. So don't forget, subscribe if you like more stories like this, and visit criminalclaws.com for nail art and accessories. I love you guys. I'm out.